Alright, punks, they really gone and done it this time. Illegal and legal PDF legacy armies? Oh yes, Mr. Benevolent Master, eye in the sky, thou shalt decide what is illegal and legal with complete totalizing jurisdiction over everyone's gaming tables. And don't get me started on that no step-up business. Right, in this video, I'm going to take off the gloves and pull no punches, and I'm going to tell you how it is and what we can do about it. But before I do that, I thought I'd just take a moment to reflect on the recently departed season of peace, happiness, and goodwill, and show you the two wonderful presents that I received from my family this Christmas. So the first was a limited edition stag shortbread collection from Marks & Spencer's, baked in Edinburgh, and the kind of gift that I felt deeply and personally moved to receive. The second present was also a limited edition stag shortbread collection from Marks & Spencer's, also baked in Edinburgh. You may well ask, dear viewers, what presents that I gave to my family. Well, one of them, because my relative whom it was intended for was not available for me to give it to him, I decided to keep for myself, and it was, I regret to say, another limited edition stag shortbread collection from Marks & Spencer's. As I left my family, I realised I hadn't got what I really wanted. And you know what that was? Lucrezia Belladonna, from the late 90s Dogs of War range. So I had to slink on eBay and order her myself from a blue goldfish. Well, punks, I'm not sure I even know where to start, for there has been a veritable battery of news updates released for Warhammer the Old World in the last few days. There are also, at the time of recording, 2 battle reports on Miniwargaming and Warhammer TV for you to watch games of Warhammer the Old World being played in the flesh. You have the opportunity to peer round the aristocrat's door into his antechamber, where his favoured sons, who have read the rules, get to play games of Warhammer the Old World before you are even able to pre-order them. So I should say that we are now firmly in the realm of 2 tiers of information, by which I mean those who have read the rules and are playing the game, and those mere mortals like you and I who have not. All I can give you is analysis of what we know. Can't give you any rumours, can't give you any insider information. You'll have to get that elsewhere. However, we do now know quite a lot, and there are a lot of things to discuss. Now, first I wanted to just talk about some of the news updates before I say a little bit about some of my deductions from watching games of Warhammer the Old World actually being played. Now, I'm not just going to go into the various actual kind of news snippets as I have done before, because quite frankly, there are far too many of them. Anyway, you came here for analysis, not for news, and certainly not for rumours and insider information, because there's none of that. Right, so let's start with a moan first, because there's quite a lot of moaning that I'm going to do. So the first major moan is this PDF legacy faction business. So a certain individual, named Rob, went and rather dropped a clanger in one of these news updates, where he said that the PDF legacy editions, which include lizardmen, dark elves, ogres, skaven, demons, etc., would not be considered legal in tournament play and would not receive ongoing support. He further said that if you want to come on this long-term journey with us, you would have to collect and play one of the supported factions. So if you're a dark elf and you love that faction, if you've always been part of you an ogre tyrant, if there's some, little story, little part of you that is there with the Kingdom of Sotek and the Lizardmen, too bad! You're not being supported. You're not going to be able to order any models unless you port them over from Age of Sigmar. You're not getting any support, and better still than any of that, you hath been declared illegal by the Great Tyrant. Now, of course, I thought when I read this was bollocks. Because who are Games Workshop to say that certain factions should be illegal and legal? Most tournaments, fortunately, including my own, will be organised by those who have nothing to do with Games Workshop, are not in their pocket, or getting forward published material from them in the post. And so we can make the decision of whether we allow these PDF legacy factions ourselves. And I can give you advance notice that they're in, as far as I'm concerned. Now, of course, this announcement about there being these two tiers of armies was really mentioned before, and I don't think enough people took as much notice of this when it was said that these PDF legacy factions would be released as a service to fans and for old time's sake. I thought that was extremely negative defensive wording, and my psychoanalysis of that was correct. Now, here we say they are not just there for old time's sake, they are actually declared illegal. Well, well, well. Now look, we mustn't overinterpret this. I think this was just a very, very bad piece of comms, and it's made the Warhammer internet community explode, because all those people who love all those factions, and I am not one of those, I do not have a dog in this fight, my armies are Warriors of Chaos, Bretonnians, and Wood Elves, so all of my factions are supported, lucky me. But I really feel for those guys who have those other supported factions. You know, Dark Elves, VC, Demons, Skaven, these are enormous parts of the Warhammer fantasy world, and to have them not supported and you supposedly not being supposed to play, in tournament play at least, with these armies, and then potentially not even having rules that come out immediately on launch is obviously very disappointing. Now, even these PDF legacy kind of armies and what we kind of know about them are in a sense perhaps slightly worrying. So Games Workshop have come out with a bunch of base size announcements that they put on the Warhammer The Old World Facebook group, which, to do credit for them, that's a very helpful thing to have this far advanced. And there are some things in there, like, for example, for the Lizardmen. The Slann is on a 50mm base, and the Temple Guard are on 30mm bases. Now, it didn't take too long for people to work out that that means that the Slann will not be able to sit inside the Temple Guard block because he'll have an incompatible base size. Really, they meant that the Slann should be on a 60mm base if they were going to make the Temple Guard 30mm. Now, that's really something small, and you might say, Dr. Blaxill, why are you being so pernickety about such small things? But I would say, well, look, if they really cared much about these PDF legacy factions, I don't think that they'd be making mistakes like that. I say they've also been very vague about the actual even provision of these rules at launch. And we've got this wonderful situation where we have these two books, The Forces of Fantasy, which is a lovely callback to, way, way back when, second edition, I believe, and The Ravening Hordes, also a kind of a callback, where we're going to see the kind of good and evil, although I have some problems about that, demarcation, factions there. It wouldn't have been very much to also supply those PDF legacy factions at launch as well, because when this is launched, which is going to be very, very shortly now, I want the Dark Elves and the Skaven and the Ogres and the Lizardmen and even the Chaos Dwarves to be allowed to play alongside those who are fortunate enough to have those supported armies. I think this is a really bad mistake from Games Workshop. It's a disastrous failure of comms. I think they need to reverse that, and quickly. It's really, really bizarre because, of course, the existing fans are a really, really big part of the market that they are aiming at. This is, at core, and in many respects, quite a conservative, quite traditionalist approach that they have taken with Warhammer The Old World, which, to someone like me, is exactly what I wanted. So it's a little bit strange that they've been a little bit loose about the PDF legacy kind of armies, because there are lots of players who have those armies who don't like the fact that they're not being supported, and now they've really clearly been sort of pushed out with this legal and illegal kind of business. Going on next then, before we actually sort of talk about some of these kind of rules, there have been some very interesting interviews about some of the painting and about some of the model design. Now, this is less controversial kind of territory, and I actually really appreciated these kind of sort of interviews or comments from kind of the design team. And I think that they were, in many respects, quite frank. They weren't necessarily just a bit sort of bland and sort of spun, so to speak. There was one comment that I particularly liked in the painting article, where somebody said, and I regret I don't remember their name, that we regard ourselves to be custodians of the present moment, and that there is an intergenerational aspect of these old models, and that we have to keep one eye on the past and also have one eye on the future. I thought that was absolutely bang on. That is exactly the way in which I conceptualize Warhammer The Old World. It is a point in history, a point in a story that began in 1983 and continues to this present day. The models are today's models, and they're hip and they're cool and all the rest of it, but in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, they might be yesterday's models. That there were aesthetic inspirations in the past and models from the past that not necessarily less valid because they're old, but just because they existed in a different point in time. And it's having that kind of awareness to see yourself and to see the now, relevant and all-encompassing as it is, as being just part of something bigger, part of a greater kind of journey. And that's why, in my estimations and affections, Warhammer the Old World is in reality 9th edition. And I say that with due respect to the 9th Age, but this is the real 9th edition of a broader kind of game. And those who are painting and those who are sculpting are reflecting, the aesthetic, the fantasy kind of influences, the human influences of the people who are working on it of the present time. I just really liked that. I thought that was extremely respectful to the Warhammer lore, but was also not unnecessarily fasty, reiterative and conservative, because it also, they also discussed how they might have flexibility to put their own stamp on what they are doing in the now, rather than kind of merely reiterating a kind of a nostalgia product, when nostalgia is clearly a very large part of their appeal. They said that, they mentioned some points about model design and the greater kind of sophistication in the details that they can put on models. Now, that is indisputably true. Models now are much more detailed than they were in the past. In my opinion, that is the reason why models now are worse than they were in the past rather than better, because I do not think that detail is good. I think that if you are a very, very good painter, then detail can be good. I think if you are anything from good to intermediate to lower, I think simpler miniatures are easier to make look better. They even said that what they were able to do now was to take things like old artwork, which was of course incredibly detailed, and actually put that artwork on models in ways they hadn't been able to do before. And I think that's probably right. But I guess, do you really want a kind of a model version of a very detailed piece of artwork? Superficially, you might say, yeah, I just want as much detail as possible. I want it to look as realistic as possible. But I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that 28mm models, or larger ones, as they now seem to be becoming, are playing pieces. This is a point that the esteemed Bard made in one of his videos. That is what they are at the end of the day, and they have to be able to represent an abbreviated version of that detail, from 5 or 6 feet away. That is how we ended up with masterpieces like this. This is, of course, Slambo, who I am looking forward to be able to paint quite soon. A drawing of Slambo would probably look a bit ridiculous because he's such a simple kind of model. But somehow, in model form and in 28mm, this most simple of sculpts, with its kind of symmetry, its large flat kind of armour, is an immortal and beloved kind of classic. And so it just goes to show that you don't necessarily have to have complexity in your miniatures. Complexity in artwork, by all means. Artwork is something to be viewed in a very different kind of context to miniatures, which are playing pieces on the table. And so, while I agreed with that point academically, I don't think that advances in model designing necessarily mean that you get better miniatures. You get more detailed miniatures. That's not the same as better miniatures. There were also some points in these articles that I also thought were notable. The first was that they basically admitted that there was scale creep. That had been denied before. I knew it was a lie. You knew it was a lie. And now they've admitted it. There's scale creep, and that's why they've made the bases bigger. Apparently they agonised about whether to make the bases bigger or not, and eventually decided that things just looked a bit better by making everyone change their base sizes, and this had nothing to do with making people buy new models. I don't think so. Another point I think that's very relevant is that, of course, we have had some release catalogues of, the full Bretonnian and the full kind of Tomb King range. And we find that, with the exception, of course, of these very well telegraphed kind of hero sculpts that we've seen, like the Pegasus and the Damsel and the Tomb King on his Bone Dragon and all the rest of it, which I think is a very good model, incidentally. I don't often say that about new models. That they're bringing back a very large number of old models, also in metal as well. There are models here, in the case of the Mounted Squires, which were brilliant models, I hasten to add. Although, to be honest, I think many of the models from the 90s and 80s were brilliant and indeed better than the ones today, so that's not really the point. Those mounted yeomen are from the mid-1990s. I mean, we're talking about models that are 30 years old. And these are people who are talking and using the word modern in relation to Warhammer the Old World. I don't think it's a modern game when you're rebooting models that are 30 years old. They're brilliant models, don't get me wrong, but it's interesting that they're going back to those. And I think what that clearly suggests, which is something that I believed right from the beginning, and you can see that on my first videos about this, that this was going to be a boutique product, a low-budget game, in other words. That I think a lot of this is about Games Workshop recapturing this market share, making a supported game which, you know, other franchises like Total War can kind of spin off from, and they control the IP rather than leaving it to go rotten in 20, 30-year-old books. And I don't think they are putting a large amount of money into developing this game. That's also one of the reasons why only half of the factions are being supported. I think we'll have a few real marquee kind of hero pieces, and I think that may have something to do with an inclination towards hero hammer in the rules. And then most of the other sculpts are going to be ones that are going to be brought back from back catalogues. Now, of course, there are, and this is a really interesting point, I think, quite a lot of very high production value Age of Sigmar models that could quite easily transfer into some of the Warhammer Fantasy armies. And I don't know whether they're going to be marketed on square bases for Warhammer Fantasy. Indeed, many people have pointed out that given there are new Lizardmen and new Skaven for Age of Sigmar, that it seems particularly inexplicable that these factions won't be supported because they have, you know, a lot of models, many of which, although not all of which, would be directly compatible with Warhammer the Old World, which they could have shifted across and have chosen not to do so. But again, I just think this confirms that this is a boutique product, it's quite low budget, and that's not something that we should consider to be a problem. This is also the reason why I think it's aimed a lot at existing players. There aren't that many Warhammer Fantasy players really, but correspondingly, this is a relatively low budget game, and I think, or my theory is at any rate, that this is about Games Workshop being able to secure the IP of Warhammer Fantasy, which is very valuable, and they were very, very stupid to discard with Age of Sigmar, regardless of what you think about the decision to bin Warhammer Fantasy as a game, to plant their flag in that, and to be able to control it once more and to update it in all sorts of ways that would be beneficial to them. And all this means that I don't think Warhammer the Old World needs to sell like absolute hotcakes for it to be regarded to be successful, which is wonderful because it gets us away from the supposed reason why they had to kill 8th edition fantasy and all that shebang because it wasn't selling enough. Now we've got rather different and adjusted kind of expectations. We're not expecting the Old World to be Warhammer 40,000 or indeed even Age of Sigmar. It's a boutique product, and a lot of the stuff is coming back from the past, and only about half of the armies are supported. But quite frankly, as I've said before, that's a lot better than nothing. One final thing before we talk about the rules I thought I'd mention was their article about fluff. Now, they kind of doubled down on this good versus evil thing again. Now, astute viewers might notice when they did their core versus PDF factionalizing that they initially put out a list of good and evil, and then they kind of redacted that later, and just presented kind of all of the armies as they were. Now, of course, Tomb Kings were historically neutral, and now they've been rebooted as being evil. Now, I just don't buy this. I don't think Tomb Kings are evil, but in their little article about it, they were very mindful to tell us that Tomb Kings should be regarded as evil for the following reasons. Well, first of all, Tomb Kings are imperialists. They want to kind of settle new lands and expand their borders by force. One of the factions that we have already is called the Empire. And they're meant to be good. I'm not really sure I bought that. The next thing was that Tomb Kings were tyrannical. Well, there we are. I'm not really quite sure how many other Warhammer factions are non-tyrannical. Is Bretonia some kind of liberal democracy? What about the Empire? What about dwarves? These are the good guys, right? I think they're rather in the grip of some ruler with near tyrannical control. And really, I think that a lot of this came down to, and I think they kind of revealed it there, that it's just quite hard to imagine skeletons being good. Right, okay. Well, a bone man must be evil, mustn't he? It's really as simple as that. Humans and elves and things, well, they're obviously good. And other kinds of creatures that are a bit less human-y are obviously bad. I don't like that kind of good versus evil kind of binary. I like the fact that there's some ambiguity in the allegiance of certain armies, such as Wood Elves and such as Tomb Kings. They don't have to be unambiguously good or evil. I think that's a simplistic school playground binary that I don't think they necessarily need to entertain in a world that is as nuanced and developed as this. So let's see what we can deduce from these battle reports. Now, I should say that I think this information is going to go out of date very quickly, as more battle reports from those favoured sons who have that insider access to the rules appear online. So I can only speak of the two that I have seen on Warhammer TV and Miniwargaming. The latter is by far the better of the two, in my opinion. It features Stephen Luca actually working out what this game is like, and is perhaps a little bit more genuine. The Warhammer TV one, however, is a lot more explicit, and it contains highly contrived kind of situations which I think are designed to demonstrate various kinds of special rules in that very sort of voice that all these people in these videos seem to have. I'm not really in a position to complain about over voice acting after all. Anyway, so the first one is that there's no step up. This has caused a lot of debate online. So let me tell you what step up is for those of you who don't know. Step Up appeared in 8th edition. It's simply that if a model dies, it gets pulled from the back rank, and so therefore models who still have base-to-base contact at their initiative step are able to swing. Prior to 8th edition, if you lost models, they actually came out of the front rank. They were usually pulled from the back rank for convenience sake, but if you lost 3 dwarves, so those Poncer Chaos Warriors or those High Elves, 3 less dwarves would be striking back when you came to swing. Now, it seems that even though 8th edition is really not everyone's cup of tea, that a lot of players, even, the really pro, slightly evangelist kind of 6th edition ones, I love 6th edition too, by the way, but I prefer 8th edition, have, I think, kind of, in a sense, recognised that Step Up, there were good arguments for it, even though it wasn't essential to get great games of Warhammer Fantasy. Now, here's an example of this from the Miniwargaming battle report here. Now, you can see that we've got 2 Bretonnian Knight Wedges, which have charged some Ushabti. They've also got some mounted yeomen there in the flank. Now, the Bretonnian Knights and the yeomen and the horses all strike before the Ushabti, and they did enough damage to stop anything except the Ushabti on the left from fighting back. So therefore, they took 2 casualties, only 1 guy therefore gets to swing, only 3 attacks. Now, I'm not sure if the Miniwargaming guys got this kind of correct exactly, but there seemed to be some confusion about who had actually inflicted the casualties as well, and how that interacted vis-a-vis Step Up, but I'm not sure they were right about that. I think it's just simply the number of casualties that are subtracted from the front rank, and then you fight back with those models. Although it does, if the Ushabti are only able to swing back with 1 guy, it does rather kind of beg the question, where exactly would that 1 guy be? Would he be on the left and only be able to strike that 3-man knight unit, or would he be there on the right, able to pump out some attacks to the side on the mounted yeoman? I'm not entirely sure how that resolves itself. But to be honest, those are all real details. The core thing is that Step Up's gone. And for low initiative armies, that's going to create combat kind of situations where you're probably not going to roll a lot of dice a lot of the time. So what has happened in these 2 battle reports, and I won't give away the results of them, but let's say that, when the higher initiative army kind of charges in or strikes, sometimes there aren't too many of the low initiative guys, the skeletons, that get to strike back. And so, there can be some quite unequal feeling kind of combat situations in that way. Now, of course, we had great Warhammer Fantasy prior to Step Up being introduced. But I do think that there was a certain feeling of kind of egalitarianism to kind of Step Up combats. Both sides got to roll dice, and so both sides felt as though they were kind of represented in combat. Whereas if you don't have Step Up, a rank gets cut down, and the guy with higher initiative wins combat by miles. The other guy just feels as though he's kind of being pasted. And I don't know. I don't think that simulates as much fun as when Step Up was in. I don't think it's a deal breaker by any means, but I do think it's, a kind of a shame. Now, of course, we'll have to see, how the game actually might function with house ruling Step Up back in. The fans can always put it in. We're already going to be breaking the code of laws by putting in those PDF legacy factions. We could put Step Up back in as well. But, hopefully they will have designed those lower initiative kind of armies, vis-a-vis the fact that they know that a lot of the time only a few of the guys are going to get to strike. So, let's hope that that is kind of baked into the pie and we still get balance. Now, the next thing, and this is more perhaps my particular kind of analysis here, is magic. Man, I thought the way magic worked in these battles was as boring as hell. I really don't like this 2d6-a-thon kind of magic phases, well, lack of magic phase, where you cast the spells in every phase, and you can cast as many spells as you have that work in that phase, like 2 magic missiles, and you just roll a 2d6. In all the battle reports, virtually without exception, every player who can cast a spell casts one, and every player who can dispel the spell dispels one. Now, in the Warhammer TV battle report, there's no wizard on the Bretonnian side, so that changes things kind of quite a lot. So there doesn't really seem to really be any kind of consideration about kind of you casting, because it always seems to be a good idea. Further still, some of the casters that are involved in these battles, like, for example, on the Tomb King side, like the dude on the big bone dragon, or a Lich Priest, I think, which Luca leaves a unit with, most of the bad things on that miscast table that we've been seeing hurt the unit. They don't hurt the spellcaster. And so the moment you get a spellcaster who's on his own, basically the worst he can take is 1 strength 6 hit, which doesn't even have AP 10 anymore, or AP 3. So there doesn't really seem like any real disadvantage to just casting, or to pretty much dispelling kind of willy-nilly, apart from that double 1, which is only a 1 in 36 chance in any case. And even some of the things on the miscast table actually kind of enable you to get the spell off, or enable you to get the dispel off in any case. So I didn't like that. The other thing, and this is more broader, was I just think the way that magic is manifested in a fantasy kind of simulation is important. I don't think it's just the effects that matter. I think the simulation of it is very important. Now, when you have winds of magic, there's the feeling of magic being something kind of unstable that must be channeled through spellcasters. Experienced wizards, perhaps only tapping into it a little bit. Inexperienced ones, trying to really power stuff through to make up for the fact that they're not really as good at controlling the kinds of winds of magic. Now, with these old world battle reports, I just found that magic and the kind of innate abilities that armies had, for example, the Tomb Hierophant King's Hierophant's Arise ability, which kind of allows you to bring back skeletons, the Tomb King's My Will Be Done, which allows him to kind of add initiative or weapon skill, those things just work on a leadership role, and they just work in the start of turn phase. In the magic, casting spells, which also happens in this start of turn phase, all you need to do is beat a number and add your wizard level. They're both 2d6. The only difference is one of them you have to kind of, roll less than 9, and the other one you have to roll about more than 5. Basically exactly the same thing. So abilities might as well be spells, and spells might as well be abilities. There doesn't feel like any real distinction between those on the gaming table. They just seem like things that just can be done and just kind of happen. The only difference is that a spell can be dispelled, which also involves rolling 2d6, by the way, guys. And these innate abilities just automatically work. I just think that loses so much texture and so much kind of color about the way magic is manifested. And I just think that's a mistake. I find it to be much blander and much more boring, even though I still think that the game overall, with magic at the kind of power level that it is, might still be really awesome, but it will be in spite of the way they have decided to manifest magic rather than because of it. Now, another thing that I think was very important, and this was more evident in the Warhammer TV battle report, I think, was Hero Hammer. Now, this is a slightly pejorative term, slightly incorrectly pejorative term, I think, that people use about 4th edition and 5th edition, which was very famous for its OP kind of characters with all their magic items. Now, in the Warhammer TV battle, basically, spoiler alert, sorry guys, the Duke on his Pegasus more or less kills everything, and, the Tomb King Bone Dragon kind of more or less kills everything until, the Pegasus guy kills the dragon. That the vast majority of points that are scored on both sides, especially for the Tomb Kings, are caused by these characters. And because they have high initiative, certainly in the case of the Bretonnian Duke, other guys don't really get to swing against him because they've got ward saves and regen together. Again, they seem very, very well protected. They've got merged profiles, and so these monsters and riders have got like 7 wounds. Their heroes just feel really super strong compared to rank and file. And so I do have a slight kind of doubt that we're going to get perhaps a kind of a balance between heroes and rank and file that we had in 6th edition, and quite frankly, we also had in 8th edition as well. It feels as though perhaps, they're going to bring out these big hero models, which they're going to put all their resources into and have these really kind of over-the-top elaborate models, and they're going to make them the best pieces on the gaming table. I have a feeling that this looks like Hero Hammer. It looks like heroes, are going to be really front and center. Now, that is going to be something that some people, although I suspect a minority of fantasy players, are going to like. But I think it's going to feel a bit more like 4th and 5th ed in that regard. They're going to be big heroes and monsters, and they're going to be super powerful. Now, this was another point that I thought that was quite interesting. Now, a really powerful mechanic, and this often can decide games in high-level tournament play, and this has been the case. This is the case in 8th edition, and I think in other previous editions as well. Although I think I might be wrong about that, but certainly it's true in 8th edition. If I wipe out, or cause to break one of your units on your turn, and assuming I don't pursue you, and I restrain, I'm able to turn my unit round. I'm then able immediately to charge again on my turn. So the fact that if you have an instance where, there is a unit death on the turn of that controlling player who controls that unit, then his opponent gets a big advantage being able to spin his unit round. Now, this obviously was the case in 8th edition, but I think it might be a still more important factor in Warhammer the Old World. Now, consider that units are going to be breaking and fleeing far less often than they were before. Now, I know these battles kind of feature undead, and so it's a little bit harder to kind of tell this, but remember, all of the units have got this form of innate kind of stubborn, which they will only break and flee if they fail a roll on their unmodified leadership test, or they will give ground reluctantly or fall back in good order. Now, in the event that they give ground and the opposition unit pursues them, they count as charging again. And that means that they'll get all their charging bonuses and strike at high initiative. So it's quite likely, as we see here in this diagram, if you look at here on the right-hand side, there are some Bretonnian knights and a duke who have charged into a skeleton archer screen. They actually fought quite badly in the first round of combat and only killed maybe, say, half of the archers when crumbles were considered. Now, in the next turn, because the undead unit gave ground and these Bretonnian dudes followed up, they were able to swing again and then eliminate the archer unit completely, again with all their charging bonuses. Those two characters, that character and that lance, were then able to reform and then hit the side of, that other kind of skeleton block that you can see on the left-hand side of it on this diagram. So, if troops aren't just kind of caving in one combat phase and you're getting charging bonuses in the second, it's going to be quite often the case that a whole unit is just going to be cut down at the second turn of asking, which is going to make the chargers turn round and then give them, free pick of what they charge in the next turn, because you're killing something in the enemy's turn. I think that's going to make the old world seem kind of quite swingy in a way, that you're going to have a lot of instances where it's going to be way better for you to be wiped out completely by a charging unit than have like a couple of guys left ready to be finished off in your turn before the enemy unit turns round into an optimal position and then rams something else. I think that this is something that might make knights rather good, I have to say, because they're going to have that ability. And then they're going to be able to have like long charge ranges, when they turn round and then slam into something else. Now, some other things, smaller things, it seems like monsters can just stomp everything. You can stomp cav, you can stomp dragons, you can do whatever. All stomps are just kind of extra attacks that automatically hit. In 8th edition, you could only stomp stuff that was infantry. If you were cavalry or bigger, you couldn't stomp. So suddenly, the monster, who was previously a bit rubbish against knights, for example, because it couldn't thunder stomp them, now becomes actually kind of really good against knights, because it might get quite a lot of, high strength, although admittedly maybe not high AP, kind of attacks against them. I don't like that simplification. I would rather that troop types kind of interacted, because it seems much more plausible to see like a Pegasus stomping infantry than a Pegasus stomping a bone dragon, which doesn't really seem to make much sense to me. Now, another thing I noticed, which was also the case in the mini wargaming kind of battle report, which I think was potentially something quite important, but something that could actually be really good, actually. I would have to see how it plays. Now, there are some instances where I noticed that, like say, Luca had deployed really close to impassable terrain, and he said, well, actually, you don't need to keep an inch gap between impassable kind of anymore, or indeed even other kind of units. Now, this kind of inch gap has been something that has always been there, I think always, in Warhammer Fantasy, and has had quite important spatial dynamics for all sorts of reasons that are kind of quite gamey. He also said that when you wheel, specifically you wheel when you're charging, you are able to ignore other troops that are in your way. So we see here in this diagram, the Ubshabti are trying to charge one of the knight units, and there's obviously a chariot in their way. Now, in previous editions, the chariot would just block the Ubshabti. There'd be absolutely nothing that the Ubshabti can do. Now, they are able to wheel through the chariot, almost to like teleport wheel through the chariot into, this other lance formation that they're trying to charge. Now, as it happens, the Ushabti roll badly for their charge and do not make it in. But that's what would kind of have happened. Now, they don't actually finish in that position. That was a demonstration. Luca then puts them back to their original position afterwards. Now, in a sense, it's kind of nice. You don't chaff or block your own kind of units. You don't have a situation where you've got two lances next to each other and they stop each other kind of wheeling, which can create some gimmicky kind of situations. But I also think that this, while it sounds nice, could lead to some pretty gamey situations as well. So, for example, say I've got a kind of a glass cannon unit, and I don't want you charging it. I put like an anvil unit in front of it, because I know that my glass cannon unit can teleport wheel over my anvil unit. And so you're going to have quite interesting situations where one unit like pops out from behind other units that are, overwhelmingly kind of in front of it. And that could lead to some quite bizarre kind of situations, and I think a new kind of gamey play. It sounds great in theory to have this kind of liberalization on these kind of charging wheels, but I have to see how it kind of worked in practice. The next thing are some of the way these skirmishes work. I mean, man, these do seem pretty loosey-goosey to me. Now, skirmishes in 8th edition were codified and made much more sort of strict than they used to be in previous editions like 6th, where they have 360-degree arc. In other words, they conformed to basically normal regiment kind of standards and had flanks and rear and fronts, etc. Now in this, you just seem to just basically pile up the skirmishers kind of any old how, just within 1 inch of each other. You can have one guy that's a bit more forwards, other guys that are further back, which is just kind of inherently really imprecise. And as I say, it looks nice, but I'm not sure it works that well. So you can see that on the left here, the 5 mounted yeomen in front of those skeleton chariots declare a charge against them. And they go in, and then they all just sort of form into a kind of a single rank. Again, that's quite interesting the way that kind of works. I mean, you just take models from the back rank, and then they go in the front rank. Presumably also enemy chargers have to decide whether they're in the front or the rear based on the model that's furthest forward kind of on his own, because obviously you might be able to get to, say, a single mounted yeoman but not the other kind of mounted yeoman because they're further away. So I think there are some curious potentials there. These skirmishers, by the way, they can run in, they can shoot, and then they can move again after they've shot, which is part of, simulating the kind of fast cavalry dynamic. Now, fast cavalry were already really good in 8th Ed, I should hasten to add. Had loads of kind of agility. Now it looks as though they're going to have even more. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for enemies to get charges on fast cavalry if all they want to do is shoot, because they can go in, shoot, and then move away again. So again, I would have to see what that kind of looks like, because how these could be used in high-level play is another matter. I should say that while I think Steve and Luca are kind of perfectly good players, what this game will look like in the hands of a real gamist is yet to be determined. There's a big difference between those guys who are, say, good players, but I've only played a few games of it, and GW demo videos. There are some things in here, some of the things I've kind of outlined here, which I think could be highly abusable and highly breakable. Let's just see. There were points in both of these games where reserve units, based on the scenarios they were playing, and we know very little about the kind of scenarios, I should say. That's something they kept very quiet about. There's a big scope for improvement there on scenarios, not just kind of kill each other, maybe capturing objectives and all that kind of stuff. Age of Sigmar, for much as I would criticize it, has got some quite interesting stuff with, objectives and things that went perhaps beyond what fantasy ever did. But some of these scenarios involve some units coming on as reserves, including potentially randomly determined ones, like potentially having, your general kind of coming on his own in a later turn. And I'm not quite sure whether they were actually rolled for or not. So there's a chance that some of your army might not appear on the board, depending on some of the scenarios, which also is cool, but at the same time also that is not something that the gamists are going to like that much. But, again, house rules, etc., could kind of come into play. Another thing I noticed was that base to base seems kind of slightly irrelevant. And by which I mean, I know it's old news that everyone in the front rank can swing. We already know that. But what I mean is where those attacks are directed. Now, in the Luca and Steve battle report, there are points where Steve actually decides to nominate attacks going into a champion. Or Luca nominates attacks to go into the Bretonian prophetess. And that suggests that, you know, if you've got base to base with those models, you can direct attacks into them, which I think is kind of really cool. I'm glad that's, you know, I'm glad that's kind of in. But, you know, in the Games Workshop battle report, when there was a lance in the side of the Tomb King regiment, there were quite a few knights which would clearly not have base-to-base contact with the skeletons, but only had base-to-base contact with the Tomb King, which were allowed to just swing into the skeletons. So perhaps there's a rule that says you can just always hit the unit, which stops the opponent kind of cock-blocking you with kind of characters and nifty kind of make ways and all the rest of it. That's, you know, obviously something kind of quite gamey that they might have got rid of there, you know, having the rule that you can kind of always, you know, hit the unit. That probably would be a good thing. In all honesty, even though you lose some tactical, although perhaps rather gamey nuance from it. Line of sight. That's another thing that I noticed. That now does seem to be kind of much more sort of literal, in the sense, well, not literal, in fact, probably not literal, which is to say that literally with firing archers and firing trebuchets, you literally had to be able to trace an uninterrupted line of sight to your target, unless they were elevated and on a hill. And you know, that also has some kind of quite important sort of kind of implications as far as things like shooting and spells are concerned. Shooting, by the way, did actually look kind of quite effective in these kind of battles. It looked as though it, you know, small arms fire took away quite a bit more. Less so kind of the magic missiles, but line of sight might be a bit more important. In terms of the magic, Lucas said he thought it was nerfed, which was just kind of interesting. And I think that it seems to me as though the anti-magic people are probably in control of this kind of edition. That to an extent, there's probably been a bit of a reaction against the perception that magic was too important in 8th edition. I don't agree with that, as you know, but it's a popular view that it was. I think there were a couple of broken spells. I think they should have been toned down, and then I think it was pretty much perfect. You can't cast spells into combat, by which I mean including like kind of hexes and buffs. You know, which also kind of seems quite important. I think I've got that right. You sort of have to cast them before the kind of combats happen, rather than charging in with your knights and then throwing in a harmonic convergence, you know, on the unit, which might mean that you have to plan a little bit more with your spellcasters. Incidentally, for those sort of start of turn kind of spells that you have to cast before you're allowed to move, obviously you're casting those after the enemy has moved. And so if your forward arc is important, then you've got to position your wizards in such a way that you think the enemy will still be in your arc after he's moved. Now that is definitely tactical, to give them credit. I think that they've been strawmanning this thing about movement and positioning of wizards being important, but if that's the case, and you have to kind of anticipate where your enemy is going to be before you spell them with the start of turn spells, some you can cast after you move, then that would definitely add an extra positional nuance to the wizards. And then just really a couple of things. One of them, which also improves shooting, and you know the fact that guys are slower improves shooting as well because there's more time to shoot, is that Lucas said that stand and shoot counts towards your combat resolution, you know, in the combat where you kind of run in. Ooh, that's interesting. Really, really interesting. So now those wood elves maybe get to stand and shoot, and they might kill 5 guys when they're charging. Now those wood elves will start really far up in combat, you know, assuming the chargers kind of make it in. Just an interesting variation, but it seems to me to make shooting kind of better. And then finally, really, there were just a couple of little things that Steve did in the Mini Wargaming report that I quite liked. First I've mentioned was actually targeting champions and targeting enemy characters rather than just always hitting the unit. But the other one was a cascading combat, by which I mean that you do 2 charges, and resolve the first combat first, and then with a pursuit or an overrun, one of those units then interacts with the second unit that you've already got a charger into but haven't resolved yet, and they both then get to fight. That's a feature of kind of higher level play, and there was a cascading combat that I saw, you know, in this battle report where Steve used his mounted yeoman to declare a charge that I don't think was in arc, but who knows, maybe skirmishing troops don't have arc, and then connected with his knights and was able to fight a second round of combat. So those are some of my conclusions. I'm sure there are lots of other things that you've noticed that are also interesting and that you can make deductions kind of from. You know, please mention those in the comments, you know, if you would like to discuss them. And so that kind of really ends this dispatch. I'm making this video, and tomorrow morning, Warhammer the Old World goes on pre-sale. I'm expecting crashing websites and lots of disappointment, as various kind of stockists find they don't have enough sets to be able to satisfy everybody. So punks, are you going to be joining the queue? Are you going to be lining up online, obviously, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. to get your Warhammer the Old World? Are you going to be part of the herd in a great stampede, flattening all before it? Yes. Maybe you'd like to come and play 3rd edition with me.